defined policy or OPA defines policy. Well, let's put it in the terms of like these container runtime engines that are out there. And so there's Falco, there's Aqua, Twistlock, sig-security, which is based upon Falco, StackRox, Capsulate. I want to say it's not Fresh Tracks, but something like that is another one. There's a few others out there. And each one of these tries to define a policy around what's allowed to run in a cluster and how it's allowed to run in a cluster. And this is above and beyond what you would do from a vulnerability scanning and then having an admission controller to make sure that the image doesn't have any known vulnerabilities in it.
Sure.
Beyond what you would do with mandatory access controls and pod security policies and things like that.
This is essential. I mean, per its name, the runtime. I mean, this is like literally like at the syscall level, like putting filters.
Yes. Yeah. In either doing it via kernel taps, either kernel modules and eBPF probes, the way Falco and Sysdig and Capsulate do it, or by, and even StackRox uses some of the Sysdig code as well. I want to say Twistlock or Aqua, one of the two, do more of like overriding the LD preload. And so like all of these tools have different ways to configure this right now. And usually what it is the end user administrator has to go to the GUI of the tool or manipulate the tool directly like you would with Falco, instead of having like this ability to define this runtime policy as code and applying it in a declarative manner like you can with like pod security policies right now. And so really the idea is can we create this API or specification that basically allows the end user to configure these different tools in a common manner across the different tools, and then having some sort of a plugin that then translates the RPI manifest, as we're calling it, into the specific tool. So it would look something like this, right? So you post that manifest into a CRD, or maybe it's in the Kubernetes API, maybe probably CRD is probably the easiest. And then that CRD contacts the appropriate RPI plugin and then goes and configures the appropriate tool underneath accordingly. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just trying to, so the one gist I'm trying to get my head wrapped around is, I mean, at the block diagram level, that all makes sense. Why wouldn't OPA just be another RPI plugin at that point? Even though it's not monitoring syscalls or eBPF kernel level stuff, it could be. It just, that's not their use case today. They chose arbitrarily admission control because it had a webhook and not, but it doesn't mean that. So I guess in favor of this idea of RPI, why wouldn't that essentially obsolete OPA the agent, not Rego the policy language? That's a different discussion. But.
Yeah, because there's no reason why what RPI has doesn't get boiled down to Rego at some point, right? Or compiled into Rego, or maybe you just specify Rego and then it's compiled down into the appropriate language, or
right.
Like the Falco language, right?
Right.
So that's definitely a possibility. More of what we're trying to solve is this idea of relationship between the objects that are running inside of Kubernetes and the subscription to the policy of the runtime engine, right? So, for example, we have this here, right here, and this is essentially Falco rules for Nginx. And the way that we're managing this subscription, if you will, to these rules is basically you define yourself as an app Nginx and that you're a container, and your container image name contains Nginx, right?
Yep.
So this isn't really robust enough, and especially as you want to layer on policy at the cluster level or namespace level or deployment level, and also giving access to developers to add in their own additional policy and things like that. This kind of hierarchical thing is what we're trying to go for, and this mapping of policy to Kubernetes objects. And so the way this macro could actually be rewritten is something more like this, to where you just say, if you've applied this label to your namespace policy nginx, you'll automatically pick this rule up, right? This could be done via RPI. This could be done via another method. Like I said, it's like we're trying to solicit feedback because we know that it's not well thought out, and we want objections so that we can start to answer these questions.
Yep, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just for your own edification, I did talk to Tor and Tim from Stira today.
And just, I mean, it's funny because I was on a call with Tim earlier. It's like everyone like ships passing in the night.
Yeah, and this was something we had set up like a couple months ago or a couple weeks ago from his CEO talking to our CEO.
Sure. I'm just curious, what was their take on, and I can circle back with them too.
Their take was that it's interesting. However, this idea of policy, like, there's not a set naming schema around this. So like, not every provider is going to have something, like Aqua is not going to have something named CISV 140. And so like, you can't necessarily create this thing called an RPI manifest that's then portable between different underlying engines. Like say I'm with Aqua and all of a sudden I want to move to Twistlock and I just want to port over my RPI manifest and just use them again. Well, I need to make sure that this concept of syscall is the same in Twistlock. This concept of policy is the same, and outputs and other things like that as well. And so while they thought it was interesting, there was definitely some holes in it, but then they also kind of compared it to ingress controllers. And this idea of ingress controllers where there's like a standard set of things like ports and names and stuff like that.
Yep.
But then when it gets down to the details, there's individual like annotations that you add into the controller, which are very like AWS specific or very nginx specific or very AJ proxy specific. And so maybe we think of the policy as something that's just provider specific, and therefore you're going to have to modify it.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, well, I think it's definitely worth considering. I mean, I just take a huge step back, and when I first joined this group, my initial thought, and I mean, Howard, you were here from the beginning, so I don't know if this came up ever, but I kind of thought that the whole point of this was to define kind of unified policy interface or some interface, even if you don't call it policy or call it controls or whatever you want to call it, that yes would have differences as you went to the different clouds and different underlying technologies, but you'd want some universal API.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the quandary is always like, it sounds great in theory, but then as soon as you get into the details, you find out like, oh my God, that would be a very complicated, almost unworkable API to try to encompass every possible use case. So I think my queries here are like, what are the right levels of abstraction?
Mm-hmm.
How many of those levels are there? What are they? So I think this is a good step in that direction, and drawing some concrete lines.
Yeah.
To consider. And
like there definitely be like provider specific stuff, and the provider specific stuff just needs to be handled by the plugin implementation, right? Like, Twistlock's plugin implementation is going to have to be able to translate, whatever's sent in, and Falco's plugin is going to have to do the same, and so forth. Although, and then the other thing is like, we also trying to think about this idea of like, if you go to go to Red Hat and get OpenShift, if you go to GKE and get a GKE cluster and so forth, like if you want to try and add in some secure by default type thing, then having this kind of way that the cloud provider can then interact with these underlying runtime engines makes it really interesting when these providers start offering these things up in their marketplaces, and that these providers know that if they deploy Aqua into the customer's GKE environment, there's this common interface that they can use to deploy it, even though there's like underlying implementation details that are going to be different for each one.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And that's definitely, that's really where our mindset was when we were thinking about this, because we see further down the road that hopefully Falco starts getting embedded inside of these cloud providers, inside of Kubernetes distributions like Calico is, like Weave is, like Flannel is, and so forth. And so how can we start providing an API? And maybe this just is, like I said, the Falco API and not something that's broader and all-encompassing.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right with the Calico example. I mean, you've got CNI plugin APIs and the definition of the interface there that everybody can adhere to. And of course, there are deviations from Calico to Cilium, and other CNI implementations have slight implementation details that are cloud specific or stack specific or kernel specific. But yeah, I mean, generally it allows you to plug and play any of those on top of any vanilla Kubernetes, whether it's on-prem, hybrid, or cloud hosted. More or less you can drop in a CNI plugin. Obviously, that's not entirely true because GKE, I think, uses Calico.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what Amazon uses, but
I think they wrote their own.
Yeah, right. Okay, so even more different.
Yeah. But yeah, the idea stays the same. But as Tim kind of pointed out, like you have very well defined objects in the network. And so like there's a bridge, there's an interface, there's a network, there's a router, there's a gateway, all these things are extremely well defined. Whereas in this world, every vendor's kind of implemented their own thing of what they think policy is, what they think inputs are, and so forth. Right. So,
well, you had in the networking world, you had a domain model that's passed muster for 40 years.
Mm-hmm. True.
Ports and sockets and protocols, and you've got whether it's UDP versus TCP versus
the OSI model and all that. Yeah.
Exactly. So whereas if you try to be too broad and you don't have that domain abstraction at high enough level, you're trying to be all things to all. Then you're like ASN1. Like I can encode anything as an ASN1, but that means that I have to encode everything in a very different way, and all I'm really doing is writing a compiler.
Right. Yeah.
So, interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it's good to get a number of abstractions out there and debated concretely, because we can very quickly get hypothetical hand waving and never get anywhere.
Yeah.
Like you said, even if this is just like the Falco version, but it informs the larger discussion of what the right abstractions are, great. If this becomes the right abstraction, great. I think it's definitely worth discussing.
Okay, cool.
My only concern is that there's only the three of us. I wonder how. So Howard, how?
This is a critical mass, so I won't worry about it.
I mean, how do we rally interest? I wouldn't even say support, just interest. Because we had some interest going there for a few sessions, and we had quite a number of people attending. But I don't know, maybe it's just.
Oh yeah, I think sometimes it's just timing. I talked to the Ant Financial developer I know that had been interested in policy working group regarding the Guardian project, and he's very interested. I guess it's just the meeting time changes. Not everybody get a heads up. So yeah, I think I propose a topic also for that, for the CNCF research user group, but I sort of missed it yesterday, I think. I missed up the time. So yeah, anyways, I think that just talking to people that we know that will be interested in this area of topic.
Michael, do you think, and I haven't talked to any of these guys, so just full disclosure, do you think the other heavily vendorized groups like the Twistlocks and the Aquas would be at all interested in talking, or they're just, they've got their solution and that's all?
Yeah, Chris and Liz Nova have talked about it, and Liz thinks that it's an interesting idea and that there's potential. She definitely had a few questions, and part of it is like, we're proposing like a hierarchical model. Who enforces that hierarchical model? Is that us, or is that the plugin, and those sorts of things as well? But she's open to having a conversation about it and figuring out if there's something that we can do together.
Okay, well, maybe that's the right next step, and then when we can kind of get you a better, larger audience, then maybe we schedule this so we can make use of your time.
Yeah, and it might be good to have like her on the call and just kind of get her feedback from having looked at it, and then definitely you and Torin and others as well to kind of see what everyone's thoughts are on this.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So as Robert mentioned earlier, we actually toyed with the concept of container policy interface a while ago. So have you guys considered, like, because I heard some of the feedback is like the runtime policy interface, I think runtime might be a bit confusing for people that people are thinking about, this is not that, this is just the runtime configuration cannot be, static or whatnot. So
yeah, we're not married to the name. So like if there's a better name, then happy to change the name. And I've looked a little bit at the container policy interface. It definitely looked extreme. Did you write that by chance?
Yeah, it's just a boilerplate. But okay. yeah, that was something we toyed around a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. It covers a lot more than what we're thinking of. Like the different types of policies and definitions. But in some ways, I actually like that, because could we create more of a generic purpose policy interface for different types of policy? I know people are like talking about getting rid of pod security policies in Kubernetes, possibly.
Yeah.
Because they're hard to implement and not well used and things like that. And so like, could that fall under the broader pod security, or I'm sorry, the broader container policy interface and things like that?
Yeah, yeah, and RPI proposal is absolutely, I think, one of the most concrete starting point. I think we could all work together, towards that.
Yeah.
So, like, what would be the best next step?
Well, I like Michael's suggestion that we should maybe touch base with Liz and get her kind of feedback on how to kind of merge all these ideas and and then you and I can certainly, and Erica, if she's available, can certainly give specific feedback, Michael, to you on.
Yeah, we would really appreciate that.
So that's an easy one. But then I think, Howard, we should probably reach out to Liz and kind of put some put some sort of a definition or a roadmap around, like, where could this go, given her visibility on different elements and discussions that she's had.
Yeah. So I think like we as a group starting, like, help promoting the idea. So
True. I will just say that we as a group have to become a bigger we.
yeah.
we
Definitely.
had a lot of momentum going there, and again, you're right. It could just be an off week or something.
Yeah.
But the last couple, yeah, I'd just like to see more engagement. So that was another reason I asked Michael about, with the Twitter talks and whatnot, join. Maybe we just need to do a little more outreach to those organizations and say, hey, whether you back a particular proposal or idea or not, you should be at the table and we should be having these discussions.
Yeah, it's the frustrating thing about security world and in the world of Kubernetes is that I feel like it's very vendor specific and disjointed.
Yeah, but it's early. I mean, I was part of several startups in the early PKI world, and I mean, this is just so early in the life cycle of the technology stack here.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to be doing this for 10 years before it really jumps. So, yeah, I think just like the early, I'm old enough to remember the early web consortiums and definitions, and I mean, whether it's a standards body, whether it's, a little bit more evolved process, I hope so. But yeah, we're going to have to get everybody to the table. There's going to be a lot of different priorities and agendas, but I think there's an important reason to define the abstraction at some level concretely so that every vendor, every open source project, and every operator isn't redefining the wheel in slightly different ways that make it really impossible to get scale, to share best practices and whatnot. And again, from a selfish perspective of a vendor, to your example use case, Michael, the easier I can make it to put it up on a marketplace that gets me broader distribution, and I can compete on my core technology competency and not on how easy is this to drop into my cloud. I think that benefits everybody. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
Including open source, because if I have a great open source and there's an easy way to throw it up on the marketplace as a plugin, great, then it's going to have more impact.
Yeah. Well, and of course, our motivation is to be the reference and implement the reference architecture example, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. All right. Well, I will try to get a bigger audience, so Howard and I can take that back and try to do a little bit more boots on the ground marketing for this group. And like you said, I think Liz can maybe. I don't know her personally. I've heard her on many meetings, and she's been on some of the sig-security calls. But I'll reach out to her, or Howard if you want to reach out. Either way, I think we should probably get her feedback on how to proceed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
And any of your feedback that you want to put in the doc or anything like that, I would appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
thanks
and
for the try, Michael.
Yeah, certainly. Nice talking to both of you guys.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Cheers.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Anything else you have on the agenda?
Oh, Michael. One thing I think I pinged you on Slack, but
yeah, I'm not the most.
Yeah, so Kubernetes folks has been asking me to update the working group information, and I also asked Erica's opinion. Would you like to serve as the third co-chair so that we can better distribute work? And I think you have been super amazing for the policy initiative.
I appreciate that. I guess my only concern is, again, the same concern we were just talking about. I don't want to be the co-chair of. It's not about doing the grunt work. It's about is there anyone in the group? So I think if we can come up with a strategy that grows the visibility of getting people to the conversation, absolutely, I'm happy to help with that. And if that's as a co-chair or
yeah.
scrub the floors, whatever it takes. But yeah, right now, I guess to put a fine point on it, if we kind of don't see an uptick in attendance, we don't really have a group. So,
Yeah.
We need to.
Yeah, definitely.
We could have these conversations on Slack, just one-on-one, and I'm happy to do that. But I mean, I think let's talk to Liz. By the way, have you and Liz spoken before?
Not that much, but just by email a couple of times.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to reach out to her then. I mean, if you don't feel like I'm stepping on your toes.
Oh, no. That's why yeah. By the way, co-chair in our group actually meaning the people will do the work, not
Yeah. Like I said, I'm happy to take out the garbage, scrub the floors, whatever it takes. I think it's an important. Again, my motivation here is very simple. I think it's a very important component of any robust system, and it's often the one that people think of last, but it's the first one that the operators, myself having run data centers and clouds, and it's the first thing that the operators really need to be able to rely on. It can cause a lot of pain. So, we can see by definition, you've got a whole mix of confusing options out there.
Yeah.
It makes everybody's job easier if we can kind of consolidate a definition of what policy is good. And it may not be one, it might be 5 abstractions. It might be, OPA and Falco and all these things separate, but I think we need to at least have a good catalog. Here's our, for lack of a better word, our API object model. Somebody's got to, I think, do that grunt work and put forward a proposal. So it might as well be us.
Yeah.
But that said, I think if that's going to bear fruit, there has to be a willing and engaged audience to receive that work.
Yeah, sure.
And
sure.
I mean, to be frank, I think that has to be the cloud vendors, the Microsofts, the Amazons, the Red Hats, and I think it has to be a lot of the security vendors, and where it's not all about security. I know you guys talked about multi-tenant and resource provisioning and limits. And I think there needs to be representation from all of those groups.
Yeah, I think it's just the long learning curve, because everybody's like their knee-jerk reaction is, okay, why this is so complicated? Okay, I have problem with like either deployment or like configuration. Nobody is thinking about policy at their like first thought. So that's like, one of the reason it takes time, and also because we're like basically touching about every aspect that is quite critical to Kubernetes, but they don't talk to each other. Like, has anyone know about storage policies? Right? Only the sig-security folks knows about reclaim, create what that means, but they rarely talk about that with the networking folks or the for resource like CPU or even FPGA resource provisioning. We need policy. There's like CPU pinning policy, affinity policy, right? But folks doing security aren't familiar with it, so it'll be. I think my point is, don't get frustrated. Let's just keep pushing the message to a wider audience. I think we'll get there, because the problems are there. They're not going away.
True. Absolutely true.
Yeah. It's just awareness for people that, okay, that it's the policy we should be dealing with, instead of just having more deployment tools trying to automate badly.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely spot on that right now, kind of where everybody is in the life cycle, or most people anyway, is like just proving that this can be a workable solution. And then, can we operate that at some scale? Can we, Can we follow best practices? What are those best practices? They haven't yet gotten to the point where someone's holding a gun to their head and saying, oh, by the way, you have to be compliant with some particular regulation, or even from a storage or provisioning perspective, they haven't gotten to the second or third order operational issues around cost control, or protecting against bad actors, or Bitcoin miners, or things that could not necessarily steal data but disrupt operations.
Yeah.
People aren't there yet, or very few people, and those people have crafted their own custom solutions.
Yeah. So like easy example would be for any like regulation or just business requirement, you have to do snapshot for a given interval, right? So
Right.
how's that storage policy will affect your networking policy, right? When you do the snapshotting and when you do the backup,
That's right.
it's
and how long? Yeah. And how does that impact cost? Because I mean, real world things that you see all the time on like AWS is some backup snapshot, and it doesn't the data sits there forever until someone manually cleans it out or writes a script. There's Lambda. Every version of the Lambda keeps a copy of the code and the logs, and so after 6 months of operations, you now have terabytes of data, some of which might have sensitive information and nobody's paying attention to, but it could just be a cost issue. I mean, that up pretty quickly.
Yeah. And if you don't rely on the expressiveness of the policy, you won't, get there. You can write as many scripts you want, but you will just, mess up the system configuration, and it's like, okay, I have this, but how I can deal with the network? Then I solve the network configuration problem. Then suddenly it's multi-tenancy. I have to guarantee, certain tenant need to apply this snapshotting, this network burst, but certain is not. So yeah, this is like something that people will need to address eventually, and the only like workable way is through policy for the automation. And
One last thing, just on Guardian. I've been busy with lots of different projects, so I haven't really done much since my last update, but last week. But just curious, you mentioned the Ant Financial guys.
Yeah,
I think
he said he actually opened an issue.
Yes,
okay.
I saw that.
Yeah, that's
no, and we did have a quick chat on Slack.
Okay.
Well, so I think there's definitely interest. I don't know if did you have a chance to reach back out to the AWS folks, or?
I will probably today or tomorrow, actually.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
I was just curious. I'd love to. I will try to reach out to the Microsoft folks, and I have a couple of contacts at Google, but I don't know if they're in the right groups. So I'll try. But okay, just curious.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Hey,
keep up the good work.
Well, I will. I don't know if we're going to need to meet next week, but I will reach out to Liz and reach out to Microsoft and see what happens if we meet. Great.
Yeah.
Have a fantastic week.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Talk to you later.